One thing that I've learned is that when people refer to, quote unquote, the disabled, that's the start of the problem.
Right.
People with disabilities are an incredibly diverse group. Not only because of our diagnoses or our impairments being so different, but also, because we come from such different backgrounds as well.
Hmm.
And it's not like, when you become disabled, you suddenly, become racially neutral or, and you don't have to deal with, whatever, other aspects.
Right.
So it's just this big intersectional mess
Yeah.
on some levels. And then, on other levels, you see, when people, kind of do have community support and, the resources that they need to live independently. It can be a very different experience. And, maybe, and in those cases, there are, there are supports put in place and, kind of changes made to society so that, you can participate fully and be independent, then, it's a very different kind of life. So we have people, when we talk about the disabled, we have people in prisons, we have people in nursing homes, we have people living, independently in the community with the assistance of aides, and other healthcare workers. We have people living in their homes with no assistance,
Hmm.
or maybe with family assistance or their partner assistance, or with, sometimes we even see care collectives. It's just such a broad group that we're talking about.
Right. And even, within a singular diagnosis, those experiences can be so dramatically different.
Yeah, and that's actually seeing like the broad range of experience within just the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome community was really kind of what drove me to start looking at these issues affecting all disabled people.
Hey there, and welcome to In Sickness and in Health, a podcast about chronic illness, disability, medical traumas, and everyday uncomfortable healthcare experiences. My name is Cara Gale. I'm not a doctor or a medical professional. I'm just a person and a patient who really wants to talk about this stuff more. Thank you so much for listening. I've been really moved by the response so far. We got almost 8,000 plays during our first week and reached people all over the world. We got plays all over the US and Canada, Ecuador, Sweden, Morocco, India, New Zealand, and a bunch more too. If you're from outside the US or inside, shoot me an email at insicknesspod@gmail.com or tweet me at insicknesspod. I want to know where you are and what you've liked about the show so far. It's so cool to know that there are people listening all over the world. I was hoping the show would grow and spread, but it's been incredible to see it happen so fast after such a long time of slowly working on this project. People have been telling me they're really excited about the show, and I'm excited that you're excited. Today is part 2 of my conversation with Rebecca, who was the guest on episode 3, Accessibility Means More Than Ramps Part 1. We had so much to talk about, I cut our conversation into 2 different episodes. In part 1, Rebecca talks about the ups and downs of EDS, their long and winding diagnostic process, working 10 times as hard to be half as healthy as everyone else, and redefining their value while not being able to work a paying job. From that episode, you can learn about some of the conditions that Rebecca and I both share, like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS. On today's show, we invite you to challenge some of what you think you know about disability and the cultural messages we get about what it means to be disabled. Rebecca talks about their work toward better accessible transit options for Philadelphia and plans to start a queer disability justice group, self-advocacy, diversity of disability, and some of the social and economic issues that face the chronically ill and people with disabilities. At the end, we talk about what we worry about, social security disability, and imposter syndrome. If this is the first time you're listening, welcome! Last week, we launched In Sickness and in Health with a 5-episode series honoring Dysautonomia Awareness Month. If you haven't heard them, go back and take a listen. I plan to feature a wide variety of health experiences on the podcast, but started out with a series on one condition to illustrate how different each person's experience can be while also sharing so many of the same challenges. Dysautonomia is personal for me, so I wanted to kick off the show with a series of interviews about something very close to my heart. We're all going through this together, but I cannot stress enough how different we all are, even if we were to have completely identical medical files. There are so many factors that go into shaping a person's experience of health and illness, and we try to touch on some of those in this episode. Just because something worked for one person does not mean it will work for you or anyone else. I want to ask my audience to remain respectful of the very personal decisions of my guests, and remember that the choices of others do not affect or reflect your own choices. This podcast and any of its associated content is not a substitute for real medical advice. If you're experiencing a medical issue, please seek qualified medical help. I know the system sucks, but I wish you a lot of luck. If you want to know why I started this show and why I think these topics are so important, go back and listen to episode 0, Welcome to In Sickness and in Health. Before we get into today's interview, I want to introduce a couple of terms that we'll be talking about or referencing in our conversation. The language of this stuff can get messy, and some people have very strong feelings about how we talk about this stuff. That just means we need to talk about it more. Maybe we'll do a whole episode on the language of disability, and we can go through the different terms and preferred language of different groups. We touch only briefly on a lot of different topics in this episode, and I've provided links in the show notes to find out more about them. One of those things is the social model of disability, which is a model both Rebecca and I prefer to operate under.
The social model of disability states that, that it's a lack of access in society at large that really disables us more so, or beyond that, the individual impairments. Mm-hmm. So, I'm not disabled because I use a rollator. I'm disabled because the elevators in the SEPTA stations that I need are frequently out of order. Right. I'm not disabled because I sleep 12 hours a day. I'm disabled because most jobs require you to, work more than I'm able to. In no way does this negate the need for, good, affordable, accessible medical care for people, but it really kind of puts the onus for change on society at large rather than on, the individual disabled person.
Mm-hmm. And I read something at some point, and I wish I could remember the way that it was worded because it was so great, but, something to the effect of able-bodied people or whatever you want to call them don't realize how much the world is set up in an accessible way for them.
Yup.
Stairs are an accessibility device, to go from one floor to another.
Yeah.
And if those didn't exist, you would be unable to get from one floor to the other if you're able to walk up a flight of stairs. And so most people don't really think about that and think about other bodies that might not be able to utilize that device.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And then even people who are thinking on the very basic level of oh, do I have a ramp? Do I have an elevator? They're frequently, so this kind of goes back to, even though we have so much in common as disabled people, we also have so many different needs. Are we looking at our air quality for people with asthma?
Mm-hmm.
Are we preventing people from, are we asking people to refrain from wearing perfumes? Mm-hmm. For people with, chemical sensitivities? Are we creating quiet, peaceful areas where people who, can become, overstimulated or overwhelmed can go to wind down? Right. There are ways that we could, kind of imagine a radically accessible society, but, there are just so many aspects to it. And I think it's really a wonderful thing to try to imagine and, maybe try to create on a small scale.
Right.
And then hopefully scale up.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're going towards, widespread accessibility.
Right.
But for now it's just kind of, small pockets. And even a lot of communities that do consider themselves, progressive or radical, won't be thinking about accessibility.
Right.
And I mean, pro tip, guys, like if you're not thinking about accessibility for disabled people, like you're not progressive. There's nothing, progressive or radical about that.
Mm-hmm. Something we mentioned a few times in this episode is ableism. It's a form of discrimination or social prejudice against people with disabilities. Some people are scared of this word. Some people are turned off by this word. And some people believe that it's something that simply doesn't exist. For most people, it's something that's very easy to miss. In our culture, people with disabilities are mostly invisible, and so discrimination in favor of able-bodied people remains invisible as well. It's not something that most people engage in consciously, but it's largely guided by the messages we get or don't get about the disabled. So in this episode, we invite you to join us as we talk about some of this stuff and question how the world tells us we should feel about ourselves as chronically ill and disabled people.
One thing I've found is that like a lot of people who are chronically ill, who might identify as like spoonies,
Right.
They don't necessarily identify as disabled.
Yes. Absolutely. It didn't occur to me. It didn't occur to me that I had a disability or multiple disabilities or whatever. Like I said before, our cultural conception of what a disabled person is so narrow. And so I didn't even realize I was sick for years because I was so used to feeling like crap. And because this is genetic and other people in my family probably have it. So when I would complain about some things, they'd be like, oh, everyone has that.
Yeah, the pain is how you're alive.
Yeah. So when I started getting really sick because I wasn't vomiting all the time or had a fever, as far as I knew about like what a sick person was, I wasn't that. So I didn't know what was happening to me. And the same thing was true for realizing that like, oh, I'm disabled. That's an interesting, huh. And as soon as I realized that, like, I didn't feel too weird about it, which I know a lot of people do, and that's understandable because of all the cultural crap that comes along with it. But I was like, oh, okay. And it just opened up a whole other world. And that's when you start to see the ableism. That's when you start picking up on it and you're like, holy shit, this is everywhere. It's in everything. It is ridiculous. Like, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I just am so much more aware of, accessibility issues. Like I probably never would have noticed, the several establishments that I've been to recently that have a handicap accessible bathroom stall down a flight of stairs.
Fun.
Yeah. It's like those That's little really things that I'm like, this isn't what
no one thought about this.
Yeah.
No one really thought this through.
Yeah.
Or cared.
Or
like
cared.
Maybe someone thought and was like, this isn't that important.
Right. Like, how many people are in wheelchairs? We'll be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, I don't know. I would definitely, like, encourage anyone who, who's listening to your podcast, and coming at it from, like, the chronic illness perspective to really look at, like, disability rights and disability justice and disability culture.
And just entertain the thought that, like, maybe being disabled isn't a negative thing. We only think it's bad because we take those messages, internalize them, and they silently shape how we feel about disability. Sure, being disabled is challenging and probably not what most of us had planned, but many of us feel that with disability, we've actually gained some things. Not everyone feels this way, and that's okay too. Regardless, it's an added challenge to exist in an inaccessible world that only wants to pity us or find us inspirational. But there are wonderful and talented people who are defying that caricature every day, and many more who came before us.
Yeah, I mean, like, it made me really sad when I'd be in, like, an EDS support group and people would talk about, like, ending up in a wheelchair as if it was, like, the absolute worst thing that could ever happen to you and must be avoided at all costs.
Right.
And, I mean, I've used a wheelchair in the past, and I don't use one now, and I'll probably use one again in the future. Like, it just is. It's a tool.
Right.
like any other.
And it's a mobility tool. Like
Yeah.
it actually does, provided the accessibility is there for the wheelchair.
Yeah. It's letting you live a fuller life,
Exactly.
a fuller, more included life.
And like full disclosure,
Hmm.
I have a hard time using mobility aids in public. I don't think that there's anything wrong with it. I just, and it makes me feel like a jerk that I have such a hard time with it. So going back to like, what do you beat yourself up for? This is one of those things where I'm like, oh, I should bring my foldable cane just in case, and then I'm like, no, it'll be fine. And then I'll find myself in a situation where I'm like, I've made a terrible mistake. So I'm uncomfortable with that. But if I could just get over myself and get a wheelchair that I could use, I sometimes when I need it, I could do so much more than I'm doing right now. I could go to museums again, which is something that I have a really hard time doing now and something that I've always really loved. But
Yeah.
standing around looking at things is really difficult for me now. If
Yeah,
I
that's
had a
like the
wheelchair,
worst.
if I had a wheelchair, I would be, provided the museum is accessible, I would be able to go to museums again.
Yeah.
And so that's actually something that I am trying to work on because I don't think that there's anything wrong with it. And yet there's so much of that internalized ableism. And I know that people are going to look at me weird and, ask me if I've been in an accident or like, think that I'm faking it or whatever the case may be. It's really more of those uncomfortable social situations that I'm trying to avoid. But again, that's all internalized ableism.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to say, like, I was right there with you. And it was just like, it took so much practice
Right.
of like using mobility aids in public to be able to like kind of go through the world as a visibly disabled person,
Yeah.
without kind of having that option of, hiding my disability more or less.
Right.
Like this is, people look at you. And, like, I'm not going to say they don't. Like,
Right.
people do look at you funny.
Yeah.
And people say really terrible things to you occasionally.
Yeah.
But, like, I mean, I think it's all worth it, to be able to get around better.
For sure. I totally agree with you.
It's practice. I was there. Lots of people have been there. It just takes practice.
Yeah.
And it'll get better. Like, that's all I can really say about it.
Right. Yeah. It's
Like,
definitely,
you'll get used to being the cane user or whatever.
yeah, it's definitely not going to change if I'm not doing it. So
Yeah.
I just have to start doing it.
Yeah, I don't know. If you come to Philly, we can practice together.
Okay.
I have some extra canes.
Oh, I know. I do have a cane. I do have a cane. I've been meaning to like decorate it. I think I'll feel better about it if it's like really snazzy looking.
Yeah, my rollator is covered in some really nice decals right now, and it makes me feel so good about things.
I want to maybe put some scarves on it so I can look like Steven Tyler.
Yes.
Or
Rock
like some
and roll.
streamers or something. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, that's the next thing I want for my rollator. Like those handlebar streamers that bikes have, or kids' bikes have.
Yeah, that
Not
sounds
adult
wonderful.
bikes, kid bikes. But yeah, I mean, like, it's, no one's gonna, like, I can't hide it. I might as well
Right.
make it, rock and roll.
Yeah.
As badass as possible.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, we have a saying in the EDS support group of Greater Philadelphia, perhaps you would like it as well, which is that, like, by the time you're starting to think about a mobility aid, you've already needed it for the last 6 months.
That is really true.
Yeah, so I need to take that to heart and start really thinking about a scooter.
Yeah.
Because, like, there's lots of stuff I can do, and, some stuff I can't do. That would be great to be able to do again.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess 2 years ago, I helped to form the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome support group of Greater Philadelphia, and we have a pretty broad membership at this time. But on one hand, we have people who are living out in the suburbs and have really strong family support and can afford therapies and treatments that might be experimental and not covered by insurance. And then on the other hand, we have people who are, waiting on their Social Security disability appeal, which is actually at 16 months right now in my zip code.
Oh,
So they might not have family supporting them. They might not have access to reliable transportation. So, they might not have insurance even. We have some people who, in spite of the Affordable Care Act, still aren't insured. So,
right.
we just have like a huge range of factors that are affecting the quality of the treatment that people can get and what kind of challenges they're dealing with in their day-to-day life.
Right.
And also it's just it's a very diverse syndrome. Like some people are affected pretty mildly,
Hmm.
whereas others are going to be affected much more extremely. And it's interesting kind of doing advocacy for something that is so broad and kind of finding like the commonalities that we can all agree on.
Yeah, that's been to get involved in this patient community has been really cool for exactly that reason. There are a lot of similarities that we share, but no one person.
Oh yeah, I mean, like you're definitely not going to be best friends with someone just because they have the same rare or rarely diagnosed genetic disorder as you.
Right.
But at the same time, like I've made some incredible friends through the EDS patient community. Because at the very least, they understand where you're coming from, like, and
Right.
you understand where they're coming from, and it's just so far. Like the daily existence can be so far from what most people experience
Right.
that it's kind of nice to have that common ground to work from. So, like one thing that kind of felt like a limitation with doing just Ehlers-Danlos syndrome advocacy. Um, was that like a lot of the issues that I was encountering in my day-to-day life weren't things that just affected people with EDS.
Hmm.
These are things that affected people with, just a huge variety of disabilities. Certainly not all disabled people because, we're not monolithic. But there's really a tendency for diagnosis specific groups to be kind of
Yes.
conservative. For EDS, we're looking for awareness. We're looking for people to actually invest in research. I'm not sure exactly what else we're looking for that's specific to EDS
Hmm.
because a lot of the other, better educated medical professionals, which I guess kind of, rolls into awareness, um, but like a lot of the things that are affecting us, like, access to pain control,
Hmm.
reliable public transit,
Hmm.
um, healthcare,
Hmm.
uh, being able to get places if you use a mobility aid. These are things that like affect, much larger groups of people.
Right. Yeah.
Uh,
That's exactly why I like, because I could so easily do a show exclusively about Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or about POTS. Like there's enough people, there's definitely enough of a variation of experience to do a show entirely on a single condition.
they're
Um,
huge, vibrant patient communities. Like
yeah,
I love
but
what I've learned from them.
exactly. But there's also all of these other patient communities out there who have a lot of shared interests, like you were talking about access to pain management and transportation and that sort of stuff. So, I mean, I didn't want to do something that was disease specific first because I
Mhm.
have too many, but
Yeah, which one?
right, exactly. But then also because, I've connected with all these other people that have other conditions and their experience and their the challenges that they face are equally as important and interesting as those of the people that are in my own disease community.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's just, yeah, but still like, the commonalities are huge.
Hmm.
And it's just really, it's amazing to be doing advocacy work in any group of disabled people. Because again, like, something that would be like very unusual elsewhere, like is more, people are generally more accepting of weird body stuff.
Yeah.
Which is great. Like
Yeah.
I've got a weird body. Like I need people to accept my weird body stuff.
Oh, for sure.
Um, that I'm like, I'm slow and sometimes I need to, take a break or, excuse myself for a conversation for a little bit. And, in groups where, in groups of people with, different impairments, there's kind of this you don't have like a baseline expectation of abilities.
Hmm.
People can, it's pretty exciting as
Yeah.
someone, who's, still fairly new to this kind of advocacy and organizing.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, the concept of not having a baseline expectation of ability. Like, I think if you said that to somebody who's never had any experience with any of this stuff,
Hmm.
they would have no idea what you're talking about, first of all.
Yeah.
But it would also like totally blow their mind that a baseline expectation of ability even exists,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have like, things like walking distance,
Right.
which isn't a very helpful measurement
No,
to,
because it's so different for all of us.
yeah. And
Yeah.
I mean, like, there was a point in my life where walking distance was 10 miles.
Right.
And, now it's like walking. What about rollating distance? And, for those of your listeners, I guess, in case they're not familiar, a rollator is a walker with wheels on it and handbrakes.
And it has like a little thing to sit on too, doesn't it?
Yeah, I love it. It really kind of expanded my horizons when I got one.
Yeah, that's awesome. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the like specific advocacy work that you've been doing? You've been really active in expanding transportation options for people in Philadelphia. Can you talk a bit about that?
Oh, well, I mean, I wouldn't say that I've been that I've, expanded anything yet.
Well,
Um,
you're working on it.
I'm working on it. So, one thing that is really neat that Philadelphia has is so SEPTA, the Southeastern Pennsylvania
Transit Authority.
Transportation Authority, or is it a transit
Oh,
authority?
I don't know.
I don't know. Well, SEPTA, they actually have an advisory committee on accessible transportation, and um, it's the oldest such advisory committee in the country. It predates the Americans with Disability Act. Um, I've been working on gaining membership to the community. You have to be at a certain amount of meetings and then be voted in. And one thing that where me and some other people with disabilities that I've been talking to about this is we feel like they've kind of gotten complacent.
Hmm.
Like, so SEPTA is like mostly in compliance with the ADA. And
Mostly.
yeah, and it's kind of, hit this like equilibrium where it just kind of stays like that. But we're really kind of hoping that if we get more people involved in this committee and active in this committee, and also active in attending other SEPTA events and pressuring the board, maybe we can do better than being mostly in compliance with the ADA.
Hmm. Do you have any specific goals that you're working toward, or is it just like,
Oh yeah. So let me tell you about my goals. There are really like two very separate systems that serve people with disabilities on SEPTA. One would be the paratransit system, which is a door-to-door system. And the other is what we call fixed route transportation, which includes regional rail trains and the subway, the L, the trolleys, and the buses, meaning that they don't go door to door. They, drive on the same route every day, at a certain schedule. So, so on one hand, with paratransit, we're dealing with basically it's just very difficult to be uh, you can't be spontaneous with paratransit.
right?
Like you have to book, a day or more in advance. They'll only give you a 2-hour pickup window. Like, could you imagine?
Well, it's like waiting for a cable guy to
Exactly.
come
And
pick you up.
yeah, it's basically like waiting for the cable guy to come give you a ride to your doctor's appointments. Or, heaven forbid you wanted to have a social life.
Hmm.
Your friends are waiting for you and it's 2 hours later. And, so like so this is what, that's like what the law says they need to do. Like, that's okay according to the ADA. Um, But, on one hand, like they don't always achieve it. Like sometimes people are left waiting far longer or wind up stranded at, weird places that they didn't want to go, or are dealing with like really rude drivers who obviously haven't been trained very well. Um, so on one hand, like we definitely want to, push for an improvement in scheduling and training. But then on the other hand, I'm actually working with another campaign right now called Taxis for All Philadelphia, which is my friend Matt Clark's campaign, where we're working towards making all taxi cabs in Philly wheelchair accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And a potential way that could be funded would be moving some of the paratransit rides to the taxi system, which is actually something that they've done already in New York City. Like we have successful models. But first we have to get SEPTA to the table to talk to the parking authority, and they haven't done that yet.
The
So,
Philadelphia Parking Authority. I have some beef going back
yes.
several years with them.
Oh, I think everyone does. I think that's just part of being in Philadelphia. So on one hand, we'd like to pressure them to improve their paratransit system, and then on the other, like, please at least talk to the parking authority about maybe moving some of these rides to accessible taxi cabs. So it's a long-term plan.
Right.
And then in terms of fixed route transportation, really like one of the biggest, if not the biggest issue we're dealing with, I think, is driver training and staff training in general. For example, we have like a lot of stories of people with wheelchairs who are waiting at bus stops and the buses just keep going by.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe they'll stop and say, we don't have any room, but they do have room. Or so at the front of the bus, you have reserved seating for seniors and people with disabilities. And under the ADA, you can't kick anyone out of those seats, which is, totally legitimate because, many disabilities are not immediately visible.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to, make disabled people carry their, identity card around.
Because also, we don't have an identity card.
Exactly.
They don't issue that when you get a diagnosis.
Yeah, I don't want that. I do have my reduced fare SEPTA card, which is pretty awesome. But, people from other, people who aren't from Philly might be coming and riding SEPTA and need those seats. But anyway, so the ADA says don't kick anyone out, which is fair. But and actually, no, I don't think this is the ADA. I think this is a different law that I'm thinking about here. But, under the law, the bus driver should ask people to move. Like, if there are available seats elsewhere and people who do not appear to be, using mobility aids or, are sitting in the front of the bus, the driver should ask. But they don't. And, we also just have, stories of drivers being, really rude, and drivers who, won't give people enough time to safely transfer out of their mobility device and onto a seat.
Right,
Or safely
start driving.
Exactly. So one of the issues, so obviously driver training is something we want to address. And, when we brought this up to SEPTA, they said, well, we're in compliance with the ADA, our training is, fine. But, they don't have any disabled people involved in the training.
Right.
Yeah, so you're just trying to, teach bus drivers how to treat disabled people like humans with a textbook.
And that pretty much never works.
No. And I mean, meanwhile, we're asking so have you, have you tried involving disabled people in this in the past? They said yes, but they weren't, they weren't reliable. They didn't show up reliably. Did you pay them?
Well,
No.
yeah, that's a huge problem of, there's this whole patients included movement that, biopharma companies and healthcare systems and stuff like that are actually trying to get input from patients,
Yep.
and not actually pay them for it,
Yep.
which is ridiculous because if if I was a consultant and I was offering my expert experience, I would get paid for that. But
Yep.
instead, because I am a patient, because I have a different title, even though I am an expert in being a patient,
Many
like,
of us have to be. It's a survival skill.
exactly. But apparently, that expert opinion isn't actually worth anything.
Mm-mm. No. Yeah, I actually I got an email the other week inviting me to a rare disease roundtable at a biotech conference, and actually asking me to pay $50 to attend. So I
Yeah,
actually emailed them back and I was like, I'll come if it's free.
right.
Like, can I'm disabled, like, and I do an enormous amount of like advocacy work for free and no one's paying me, so no, I'm not paying you.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
But yeah, no, I definitely and I think there may be I definitely like see a movement to change it, at least on the patient side.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely on our side. That's happening. Whether the actual people with the money will make any changes, that still remains to be seen.
Yup. Yup. And on one hand, like it's awesome that our voices are being heard. It's awesome that we're becoming more visible. But yeah, it's our time is worth something too. I do want to say that this definitely isn't something that I'm inventing here. I'm really kind of fascinated with the history of the disability rights movement.
Hmm.
I'm really lucky to be in Philadelphia because we have a very active chapter of ADAPT and also Disabled in Action of Pennsylvania, which are both some real old school disability rights organizations that are still just doing amazing direct action. And right now they're really focusing, I think, on the issues of community inclusion and, allowing people to live in the community as opposed to in nursing homes.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's just great to be able to, meet so many people who were instrumental in, making, the first generation of disability activists.
Right.
The people who made it possible for me to get on the bus in the first place, to complain about how I'm treated once I'm
Right.
on there.
Yeah.
Because there was a time when I wouldn't have even been able to get on the bus. And actually, a large part of Philly's transit system, the trolley is totally inaccessible. But they say 5 to 6 years.
Well,
But
at least
yeah,
there's some time frame.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, we gotta stay on them about that too, and make
Yeah.
sure that happens for real. And I forgot to mention, I'm working on another project too. I have a lot of stuff on the burners right now. We'll
That's
see
awesome.
what actually sticks. But some friends and I are working on starting a queer disability justice project here in Philadelphia.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah, to kind of address some specific issues that we're seeing that are unique to queer disabled people. So, for example, when we look at like some of the health providers that target the LGBTQ population here in Philadelphia, like a lot of them aren't accessible. There's an HIV testing clinic that has stairs up to it. The Planned Parenthood has stairs. There's actually currently a support group meeting for queer chronically ill people, but it's up a flight of stairs.
That is ridiculous.
So like just basic health care and like basic support, we're finding like people are just not thinking intersectionally here.
Yeah.
And then there are like some really specific issues that we're seeing in this group. Like, if a trans person with a chronic health condition goes to a doctor, very frequently the doctor will be, "Are you sure it's not the hormones?"
Oh,
Because
for
there's been
sure.
very
Yeah.
little, like education done, very
Right.
little studies done on like the effects of these things, and like, yes, when you're talking about like, a trans person with a rare disease, like that's a very small sample size.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, like these doctors need to be like a bit more savvy
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I mean, even, when dealing with young women, they blame everything on our hormones.
oh,
So
totally.
if there is a hormone to blame something on, you better believe that's what they're going to go to first with that.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I've heard that both for, like, trans men on testosterone and trans women on estrogen.
Yeah.
Like, it's, yeah, and also people who don't have any, like, people who've had, hysterectomies. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, the lack of hormones is the problem. We better
Right.
give you some hormones.
Ugh.
It's all the hormones. But yeah, so, and then, like, we also, see people, like, it's not just, chronic illnesses. Like, for example, sometimes trans autistic people are having trouble accessing hormones because doctors will say like, oh, you're autistic, you can't possibly know that.
Right. And just, I mean, the amount of self-advocacy that's necessary to get adequate healthcare access at all in a lot of situations, that doesn't necessarily come naturally for the
No.
vast majority of people. That's a cultivated skill, that certain levels of privilege kind of give you an upper hand on.
Oh, totally. I mean, being able to speak the language of the oppressor class,
I mean, yeah, I say all the time, which is just like, how lucky are we that English is our first language?
yeah,
Just
and I mean,
something as
like,
simple as that, the luck of where you were born and what language you
yeah,
happen to speak. I
yeah,
I can't imagine having gone through all this and not have
no, because
the
I mean, they're supposed.
linguistic access. Yeah.
And I mean, hospitals are supposed to provide interpreters, but again, I've heard many stories in which,
Hmm.
like, it's something that has not actually happened. It's
Right.
supposed to happen, but it didn't actually happen.
Right.
But like these kind of advocacy skills we're talking about, which are like so crucial in like the self management of chronic illness and being able to interact with the medical system. That's actually something that we were trying to kind of teach in the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome support group.
Hmm.
So, we've actually done some presentations on, we call it getting the most out of your doctor's appointment. But, really it's, how to play the system and, play their game and not like get written
Right.
off as too difficult to deal with.
Right.
Um,
Or if I've actually run into this. If you know too much, if you use the medical terminology, if you try to speak to them in their language, sometimes they'll say, "Oh, you just did all this research and you're making it up based off of the research." And it's like, "No, I'm just trying to communicate effectively. That's all I'm trying to do."
you can't win.
No.
It's a rigged game.
Yeah, for sure.
But like that's also something like we're hoping to do in the queer group in the future. Just kind of work on patient advocacy skills, and also maybe even just like provide people with someone who will come to them with someone who will come to doctor's appointments with them.
Yeah.
Like if they don't have a person like that in their life, because sometimes just having another person with you can make all the difference.
Oh, yeah. It gives you the confidence to speak up, or the other person can speak up for you. Like, I mean, plenty of times I have to wait, in the waiting room, which is
Yeah.
like, whatever, that's fine. That's what they're for. But by the time, especially for the doctors that I have to travel to see, by the time I'm actually speaking with the doctor, my
Yeah.
brain is off. It's done for the day. And so I may not be able to say what I need to say. What they're saying back to me isn't necessarily making it through.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily, my brain might not be recording any of it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, for sure. Though personally, I mean, I find that like when I have someone there, like the time I appreciate having someone in my doctor's appointments with me most is when we leave the doctor's appointment and I was like, was that fucked up? I'll be like, yeah, that was fucked up.
Yeah. Yeah. To have somebody, because
Just making sure.
exactly, there's so many times where you're not quite sure if the doctor is being an asshole, or you're not quite sure if they're being sexist, or
Yeah.
whatever it
Yeah,
is. You're just like, it's not quite as black and white as them saying like, oh, it's just your lady problems, and
Yeah.
shuffling you out the door. It could be a lot more kind of insidious than that. So having an extra pair of eyes and ears there, or whichever, you know,
Hmm.
perceptive senses that person is using, can be really helpful to just double check and say, like, am I making this up or was that inappropriate?
Yeah, I'm so glad I had someone with me during that terrible POTS doctor
Yeah.
appointment.
I
That
wish that
was
I had.
yeah, I would have been so, I mean, as I was upset as is, but like I would have been so much more upset if there wasn't someone else being like, "Whoa,
Like,
good thing
what's
you
with
told him
this
off."
guy?
It's
Yeah.
like thank you. I was afraid, because like people who grow up, as little girls are socialized to be like to
Hmm.
be nice, to be, accommodating.
And to defer to authority and whatever they have to say,
Yeah.
defer to men and whatever they have to say.
But sometimes I just have to tell people about themselves and I can't help it. And then I feel guilty.
What did you say to him?
um I told him that that I knew for a fact that, that POTS, was not connected to, it didn't matter, how hypermobile I was. That did not correlate with the severity of POTS.
Hmm.
And that I did not come here to have, to be reevaluated for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I don't appreciate being treated like a sideshow act who has to like contort myself and stretch my skin out every time I see a new doctor.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's awesome.
and then he actually had to leave the room to compose himself.
Oh,
He
wow.
came back and was a lot nicer. So, I
Oh,
mean, maybe
that's
there
good.
is something to be said for in the Philly EDS group where we've compiled a list of doctors that people have seen. Um, and it's only as helpful or like as accurate as like the individual people
Right.
who like contribute the information, and it's got a billion disclaimers on it. But I mean, it does help people to know like this. You're not going to be wasting your time if you go
Right.
see this doctor.
Well, the how I got diagnosed for EDS was that first I was diagnosed with POTS, and then I was diagnosed with the mast cell issue, and so I knew, one plus two usually equals
Yeah.
three, and so I didn't want to just go to any rheumatologist or any geneticist because I knew from speaking to other people in the Ehlers-Danlos community that just
Exactly.
because somebody is a rheumatologist, just because they are a geneticist, doesn't mean that they know anything at all about Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
Hmm.
So I knew that, like, if I was going to have somebody evaluate me for this condition and it turned out that that was what it was, I wanted to make sure that the person evaluating me would know what they were looking at.
Yup.
So the EDS NYC group has a similar list. And so, I found a doctor on there, went to see her.
Oh yeah, they
And
actually we got the idea from them.
yeah, yeah.
We've been in touch with other support groups.
Was there like a moment or like a turning point where you realized that something needed to change and that you needed to be a part of working toward that change?
I mean, I think in many ways, like it was like a very gradual sort of realization.
Hmm.
Um, and it wasn't like, I very much like just kind of followed the flow and wound up where I thought I probably should be.
Right.
Um, so, like the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome group, yeah, that was like very much just, some people said this should happen, and I wound up being like, one of the first people to, get involved and start, coordinating things for it. Along with my good friend and, the wonderful Ehlers-Danlos syndrome advocate, Amy Knauer. So that was, really just by chance. Um, and I was, I'd stopped working. I'd had a couple of really rough years, and finally I'd found myself in a position of like relative stability
Hmm.
and didn't really know what to do with myself. So, so advocacy it was. So I started out with like the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome specific stuff. But just the more I thought about things, the more I read. like the more it became clear that that my heart was really in more of a cross diagnosis kind of advocacy. And also kind of dealing with, I mean, honestly, like I'm not holding my breath for a cure for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
No, because you would die before that happened.
Exactly. And yeah, I mean, and honestly, like, a couple more ramps in the meantime would be pretty sweet. And like that I see as, a very realistic goal and one that's, going to benefit like a much wider range of people than just looking for a cure for one disorder, which I know will probably get me kicked out of the biotech conference I'm going to for free this week. But we, Philly is a very racially diverse city, but the support group is mostly white.
Yeah.
And it's really, to me that means, and since, the literature says that EDS, is not limited to people of European heritage.
Right.
Like, to me, this suggests that there's, like, a huge diagnostic gap.
Oh, of course. I mean, it's hard enough for white people with all of the resources in the world to get diagnosed with this.
Yeah. And I mean, like, meanwhile, like, we have studies showing that, like, both women and Black people are likely to, are treated less aggressively for pain.
Yeah, there was just that study that came out a few weeks ago about, I mean, like, surprising no one that young African-American children get significantly less pain medication in emergency rooms than white kids do. Yeah.
Yep. Like, so the medical system's racist? Tell me something I don't know. Right. Yeah, and I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people just don't believe something until, like, a white guy with lots of credentials is like, this is a thing. But you won't believe me and these, like, legitimate medical sources I'm showing you. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think, there's a lot of, like, intersectional stuff going on. And, one of the great things about, like, getting involved with ADAPT and Disabled in Action is that they actually are representative of, the Philadelphia population. And they're not, they're very far from all white, and are, have, like, people of color in leadership positions. It's really much more representative of the Philadelphia population than our EDS support group is.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not at all surprised that your support group is mostly white, just because how does anyone fucking get diagnosed with this? It's impossible.
Yeah, it's
virtually impossible to get diagnosed with it unless you go so far out of your way to, like, make sure you've exhausted every resource that you have, and you still might not have the resources to do it.
Yeah, I mean, like, I was incredibly lucky that I was working at a university at the time. I'd taken a significant pay cut to, like, get a job that was closer to home with better benefits.
Yeah.
And it turned out that was, like, exactly what I needed to stay employed long enough to get my diagnosis.
Yeah.
Because if I had, like, had to stop working, like, didn't have any money.
Yeah, or any health insurance, like, forget it. That's just not going to happen.
So the timeline for me was, like, I think, so what's the day you can't wear white shoes after? Labor Day? So Labor Day weekend of 2011, I guess, I had my injury. Then...
What was the injury, did you say? It
was just a random running injury that was actually a sacroiliac joint dislocation.
Oh, God. When I finally went to PT after getting diagnosed with EDS, this was a year after I had apparently I found out at PT that the year prior I had torn both of my IT bands.
Whoops.
And didn't know. I didn't know. I just was like, I'm just in pain all the time. And this is just more pain.
Too. We're just walking through it. Just walking through it. Walk it off.
Yeah. They were horrified. It's like, why didn't you go to the doctor about this? I was like, I don't know. It was a thing that happened. And
and they act like you're a complainer, but we actually have really high pain tolerance.
Unbelievably high pain tolerance.
God. Yeah, and that's how I wind up waiting like an app, like a 2 weeks for, well, no, a week and a half for my shoulder MRI for the shoulder I probably tore,
Yeah.
like because I went to the regular doctor instead of the ER because I was like, this, this ain't that bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
It's just
like, yeah,
stupid.
like downplaying things is like, it's something terrible that I do, but it's something I learned from the medical establishment
Oh,
and
for
from my
sure.
parents.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like I would describe this like essential like I'm dying feeling.
Right. To a
Yeah,
doctor, and they'd be like, I think you're fine.
irritable bowel syndrome.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with you.
Yeah.
And they did tests,
Yeah.
and they just did the wrong tests.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I really had like symptoms of orthostatic intolerance when I was young.
Oh, for
But
sure. I started having I started recognizing that something wasn't right when I was about 7 years old. I started having headaches. I started having foot and ankle pain that was not
yup,
they weren't able to find anything on radiological studies,
ditto.
the stomach pain,
Yup.
nausea, being terrified that I was going to throw up because I threw up all the time. So I just
Yeah.
like
They said it was because I was being bullied in school, which I was, and which didn't help, but that also wasn't why I was having
right,
stomach pain.
right. My parents were just like, "Oh, you're just trying to get out of going to school," which is
Yeah,
true,
mine too. But
but
like, and yes, I didn't want to go to school. It
right,
was fucking awful.
yeah, it was not a good situation. But it also wasn't helpful that I was having very real physical symptoms, and everyone told me that I wasn't.
Yeah.
That's not helpful for anyone, even if it was just anxiety.
It's like, what would have been good for like instilling like good self-esteem in me? Like not telling me that the things that I like experienced weren't real.
Right.
Yeah, mine are supportive, just a little, I mean, insensitive,
Yeah.
especially as you get towards the extended family.
Yeah.
But that's okay. But like there's, I blame ableism.
Oh,
Blame ableism on blame everything on ableism.
yeah. And people a lot of times are think that people when somebody brings up ableism, they're blaming ableism too much.
Yeah,
And
you can't.
I'm
It's
like,
impossible.
do you know what it is? Because this has happened to me on multiple occasions, even with people that I know that are extremely smart and extremely well versed in social issues.
Yeah.
It's
I mean, like,
ridiculous.
I find that it's like a conversation that you kind of, sometimes you kind of got to sneak it in. You got to,
Right.
target your message.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, when we're comparing ableism with other isms, like, it's not that it all exists in a vacuum. Like, here's
Right.
ableism, here's racism,
Yeah.
here's sexism, and here's transphobia, and here's so for example, one thing that we're seeing with like the Black Lives Matter movement is that it's not just Black people who are at increased risk of having terrible violent encounters with the police. Being Black and disabled increases your risk so much more. Huge interconnected system of oppressions by which, like, if you're disabled, you're facing ableism, and if you're a person of color, you're facing racism. But if you're a disabled person of color, you're not just separately facing
Right.
racism and ableism.
Those
Like
aren't
you're
two separate issues.
Yeah, like you're facing like an unholy union that ties into the prison industrial
Yeah.
complex and the devaluation of Black lives and the devaluation of disabled lives.
And the complete inability of our healthcare system to serve any of those populations.
Yeah, I mean, like we're dealing with like some really intersectional issues.
Hmm.
These topics are very complicated. We hope to cover them a lot more on the show. There are unique experiences and barriers to diagnosis and treatment in different age, gender, socioeconomic, and racial groups that I want to have represented on the show too. So people of color, non-binary individuals, folks in remote areas who have poor access to healthcare, other demographics who don't feel represented in chronic illness projects, please contact me. I'd love to get some of your stories on the show. So email me at insignispod@gmail.com. Use the contact form on insicknesspod.com or tweet at me at insicknesspod. Also, dudes, people who identify as men, we actually need to talk to more of you. I've had a really hard time getting guys to open up about their health problems, and there's so much stigma there too. What do you worry about with your health? Like, is there anything big or small that takes up a lot of space in your brain?
I mean, it really changes, based on the whack-a-mole game of what the most urgent problem is. Right now specifically, I'm a little bit freaked out about my neck because I know I'm looking at like a massive multi-level fusion
Ugh.
at some point.
Yeah, that's scary.
The question is just when,
Right.
like how much damage am I doing, not having it versus, how bad would it be to not be able to turn my head for the rest of my life?
Right.
So we'll see. I'm getting a couple opinions on that. So that kind of freaks me out, because that's also like that's my brain stem that we're talking about. Like
Yeah,
I
it's kind of important.
but long term, like I think that the thing that I fear the most is not being able to take care of myself.
Yeah.
Uh, or to be independent. And I think that, like, I want to say that, like, when I talk about independence, I don't mean that, that, like, every person is an island unto themselves. Like, I think,
Yeah.
I think we do need to, like, embrace interdependence. Like, I talked about, home care and care collectives as both being, great things for people to stay in the community.
Mm-hmm.
So it's independence, but, it's an interdependence as well.
Right.
So I just hope that, if and when that time comes, I'll have, the resources I need, to continue living like, the life I want to live.
Right.
Which, I'm sure will change with time, but, I think I'll always be able to find a way to be happy as long as my basic needs are being met. And I guess that's what I worry about, the basic stuff.
Yeah.
What about you?
Oh, what do I worry about? I actually haven't even asked myself this question. I don't know.
It
Let's
was a really
see.
good question. That's why I had to turn it around.
Yeah, I think I stole it from Paul Gilmartin's Mental Illness Happy Hour. That's where I got the question from. I mean, I definitely worry about, not being able to take care of myself. I worry about money constantly, obviously.
Oh, yes, constantly.
Because that, like, I'm just now at the point where pretty much my only choice is to apply for disability, and I'm like terrified because I know I'm going to get denied, and I'm just like, I don't want to put myself through all of that just to like get denied over and over again. So,
Yeah. Well, you'll get denied the first time.
right.
The second time is when maybe they'll
The
accept.
second and third time are the ones that
Yeah.
matter. Yeah, no, I know that. Like, I know the process. I know exactly what needs to happen. I just don't want to.
Yeah. Oh no, it's
Uh,
terrible. I mean, like, I think when all is said and done, it's going to take me at least 3 years to get on SSDI.
oh God.
So
Because I am running out of money very quickly.
yeah.
Like, I definitely don't have enough money to last me 3 years, so that's a little terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is a huge issue that I hear, like, again and again from people that there's just, we don't have, like, a very good social safety net in this country.
Right.
I mean, we do, but it's like, imagine if,
It's more of like a theoretically good social
yeah,
safety net, but in
yeah.
practice, not so much.
Okay, so like, let's imagine that, like, we're talking about, like, trapeze artists or, like, a tightrope walker or something, and you put up the safety net, but you only put it up 6 inches above the ground. So that, like, when it so that,
Yeah.
like, you hit the safety net and then you just go right through it into the ground and then maybe rebound a little and wind up above the ground. So,
Yeah.
like, I think, like, we make people hit rock bottom before we'll help them in this country.
Right. Like, I don't understand why I need to be destitute in order to file for disability, or, why I need to be 1,000% disabled before I qualify.
Yeah, I
know.
mean, like, there's a huge hole. There's, an enormous number of people, I think, who could probably work 10 hours a week.
Yes.
I could work 10 hours a week if it was really flexible, I think, maybe.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that you do have the option of doing once you're on SSDI.
Right. But fuck you in the meantime.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then, when we talk about things like attendant care, which is covered through Medicaid, you actually have to have, no resources, no financial cushion to qualify for Medicaid. So there are a lot of people who are concerned that if they make, even a little bit of money,
right,
the attendant care services that they need to be able to make that money and go to work are going to be canceled.
Yeah. Along with their health insurance, too.
Exactly.
Which is just so ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm really freaked out by that whole thing. The whole thing. This was, I wasn't somebody who had grand plans for my life, but I also, this definitely was not in the picture. It never occurred to me that I might have to worry about this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's something that we don't really talk about.
Right.
Which is why I think it's great that we're talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely one of the reasons that I'm doing the show.
Yeah. And also just something that a lot of, that I internalized a lot of weird judgmental things about when I was a kid, about and adult, independence above all, you don't want to be on the dole or, taking money away from hardworking taxpayers or something. Never mind that I was a hardworking taxpayer.
Right, and that you actually paid into the system and blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Something that I've actually been encountering a lot in doing these interviews is a kind of imposter syndrome. Are you familiar with the concept of imposter syndrome?
Yes, and it's actually something that I do talk about in relation to myself as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's huge. I hear it all the time too.
Yeah, the people are just well, there's so many people who are so much worse than me, so my problems must not matter. And that's ridiculous.
Well, I mean, we've created a system where everyone's just fighting over tiny scraps of benefits. And we do create kind of a hierarchy of disabled. And, we have the good disabled and the bad disabled. And
I wouldn't say good disabled. I'd say okay disabled.
Okay disabled.
Because nowhere in our culture is being disabled good.
But Stephen Hawking.
Oh, well, okay. With the exception of Stephen Hawking and maybe Marlene Matlin.
Yes.
That's where it ends.
Yep. Basically, yeah. So yeah, I mean, you've got the, the hardworking, people, disabled who are not on benefits. Never mind the fact that so many employers, when confronted with, hey, how about you make some reasonable accommodations for me as per the ADA? They're like, eh.
How about we just hire somebody to replace you instead?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there are huge barriers that are systemic, that are difficult to remove. They're difficult to enforce. The ADA is enforced via lawsuit, so you'd have to actually sue every employer who refuses to give you reasonable accommodations.
Not for any other reason than they just didn't really feel like it, or they didn't quite understand what was going on.
Yeah, but I mean, it wasn't a choice. There came a day where I just couldn't get off the couch. Yeah. And I was like, okay. And then the next day I couldn't get off the couch. And the day after that, and the day after that. And, it wasn't a choice.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe if I had been in a different, I don't know what I would have done if I wasn't, married to someone who's gainfully employed.
Yeah.
And if I didn't have actually disability insurance, private disability insurance through my old job.
Yeah, that helps.
That helps incredibly, because that, even though that took 6 months to kick in, it kicked in, and I'm still waiting for my Social Security.
Yeah. Yeah. Not only is it better than a sharp stick in the eye, it's better than nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's really sad that this is the option.
Right.
And yeah, I don't even know what to say about it other than like it's really messed up that that people with disabilities are expected to survive on sub-poverty wages.
Yeah.
And
Like our most vulnerable people in our population are put at the greatest risk.
yeah, I mean, I spend, probably over $100 on prescriptions every month.
Oh, easily. For sure.
Yeah, like hundreds on copays.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I can't always cook for myself, so I wind up buying prepared food, which is
Yep.
more expensive.
And then there's all the Gatorade. My monthly Gatorade bills are out of control.
I have a kind of expensive coconut water habit. So many electrolytes. Actually, my new jam is V8, which I'm told is
okay.
gross, but I love it.
No, I love tomato juice. Whenever I go to a conference or something like that, where like I know that I'm going to be dying at some point in the day, I will bring a little can of V8 juice because it's like the little cans are so tiny. It's like just a couple shots of tomato juice and I'm feeling better.
Yeah, no, I've definitely tried to pass it off as a medicinal beverage in certain circumstances with some success.
Oh, good.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like, back to what you asked though about like imposter syndrome is, I mean, yes, yes, like this is something that I experienced. This is something that like almost everyone I talk to with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome has experienced, except for people occasionally who were diagnosed young
Right.
and grew up in incredibly accepting, supportive families.
I wonder what that's like.
I know. Not just being like a medical mystery and
Yeah.
general like misfit.
Well, my medical mysteries and general misfits, thanks for listening to In Sickness and in Health. Subscribe and stay tuned for everything we have to come. And check out our dysautonomia series from last week. Let us know what you think about the show so far. Please rate and review us on iTunes, which helps other people find the show. And tell your family, tell your friends, tell your doctors. But most importantly, don't forget to be excellent to yourselves and each other.